Okay, so this is a city. Here are all the people living in it, people of all different colors, ages, wealths, and incomes. Except they don't all live together in the same place. They're separated into different parts of the city by what color they are, what language they speak, and how much money they have. And those different parts of the city look quite different. The parts that are whiter and wealthier tend to have green spaces, grocery stores with nutritious organic food, and of course the money to buy it, and are often far away from pollution-emitting freeways. The parts that are poorer and more diverse tend to have industrial sites, heavy-duty diesel-polluted ports and highways, and hazardous waste, all things that the city relies on to run properly, but that heavily pollute the air and water. And even if they had those grocery stores with nutritious organic food, most residents there couldn't afford it anyway. How did this happen? Well, this segregation can be traced back to race-based zoning and housing policies, but it wasn't always as deliberate as plain old racism. Some separations can simply be traced to poor land use planning. And as a result, these residents of the same city live very different lives. Say the city realizes it has an emissions problem. It comes up with a plan to reduce air pollution, plant more trees to suck up the carbon, or start a cap-and-trade program. But those trees get planted in the neighborhoods that are already green, and the factories that are spewing toxins into the air just buy more carbon offsets and keep spewing their toxins. The benefits of these programs are enjoyed by the communities that are already doing just fine, and the communities that were hurting most from all that air pollution, well, they're still hurting. This isn't just an imaginary city, this is the story of real cities all across the US where people might live in the very same area code, but their race, ethnicity, or wealth and income bracket causes them to experience wildly different quality of air, water, and life. In fact, it can even mean that they also experience different deaths. That's how serious this stuff is. This kind of inequity expands far beyond cities, too. Rural areas are full of commercially valuable resources like oil and coal, and they're also home to indigenous and low-income communities. But when those resources are extracted, those communities don't see any of the money, and they end up with all the air and water contamination that's left over from the extraction. And we even see this injustice on a global level, like in small island nations that are forced to directly confront the consequences of rising sea levels, but haven't played any significant role in the industries that are causing climate change. These peoples are sometimes forced to flee their homes because their land is literally going underwater. But the very states that did play a hand in creating climate change don't have migration policies to accommodate them. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about how we can try to break down and reimagine a system that's built up on these inequities. A system where those who are already disadvantaged because of their race and economic status are made poorer because they're unable to profit from the resources that the world depends on and are made sick or worse by the environmental contamination that comes with extracting those resources. Social inequities are intimately tied to the environment. That's why social justice is an environmental issue too.
The poor have always lived downwind and downstream from what the privileged could afford to avoid. My name is Craig Opie, and today I'm going to be talking about race, class, and environmental inequality in the United States. In the early 1900s, social scientists, civil rights activists, journalists, and government agencies began bridging environmentalism and civil rights in a movement called environmental justice. Even President Bill Clinton contributed by labeling environmental justice an important domestic priority in an Earth Day speech in April 1993. However, the road to environmental justice is not easy, and it isn't happening voluntarily by politicians. A political movement must be built through the recognition that those exploited and dominated by globalizing capitalism share a common structural relation to capital. America didn't recognize this common structural relation leading up to the Environmental Justice Act of 1992. Which was redrafted and reintroduced as the Environmental Justice Act of 1993. The act was read twice to the Senate and House, and then referred to the Committee on Environmental and Public Works before dying. This past year, Cory Booker, African-American senator of the 116th Congress, reintroduced the legislation as the Environmental Justice Act of 2019. Again, it was read twice to the Senate and House before being referred to the Committee on Environmental and Public Works, to die. America has consistently demonstrated that it's unable to be empathetic and defend communities impacted by environmental inequality because of white privilege. Paul Mahoy, a professor at the University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability, co-organized the 1990 Michigan Conference on Race and Incidents of Environmental Hazards. Mahoy addressed the disproportionately burdened community of Flint, Michigan, a location where poor people and people of color are concentrated. In his article, Environmental Justice and the Flint Water Crisis, he stated that residents are not given meaningful say in decisions that affect their communities and quality of life. Their concerns about pollution and health impacts are minimized, discounted, or dismissed, and residents are treated disrespectfully and shown they have little influence or clout. Furthermore, given the magnitude of the disaster in Flint and the role that public officials' decisions played that led to the poisoning of the city's water, their slow pace at acknowledging and responding to the problem, and the fact that Flint is a city of almost 100,000 people, indeed makes this the most egregious example of environmental injustice and racism in his 3 decades of studying the issue. With a record 56 African American Congress members, which is 10.4% of the total membership, 51 Hispanic or Latino American Congress members, 9.4% of the total membership, some which are also included in other minority demographics, such as the 2% of African Americans identifying as African Latino Americans, and a record 20 Asian Pacific Islander American Congress members, 3.8% of the total membership. That leaves a staggering 414 white American members, which is 76.4% of the total membership, in the 116th Congress, that control decisions made for minority communities. Marian Miller keenly identified, when there is separation of producer from consumer, employee from employer, and investor from investment, the decision-making process is freer to ignore externalities that might otherwise be factored in. This kind of decision-making process justifies the hazardous waste trade and the establishment of hazardous waste landfills and incinerators in poor communities. Applying Miller's research and position to the 116th Congress allows us to identify that Congress continuously tables and kills the Environmental Justice Act because the vast majority of members of Congress do not experience or see the impact of race, class, and environmental inequality in the United States of America. White privilege is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. This unearned and mostly unacknowledged social advantage is oftentimes misidentified by the very people benefiting from it. Some claim that, influenced by big oil and corporate America funding for political campaigns, drives Congress's actions, or more accurately, inaction, towards environmental injustice. But this claim equally supports white privilege argument, as white American Congress members are disproportionately receiving campaign funding to oppose the Environmental Justice Act. Awareness needs to be delivered to our representatives to protect our communities, because environmental inequality often goes hand in hand with other forms of exploitation and discrimination. Moreover, I can't help but relate the environmental harms that are subjected to with the lower standards of medical care and disproportionate arrests. If it's not enough to put landfills on their doorsteps, we show them that society doesn't even value their life any more than the trash we force them to sleep with.
When we talk about the concern of the environment as an elitist concern, 1 year ago, I was waitressing in a taco shop in downtown Manhattan. I just got health insurance for the first time a month ago. This is not an elitist issue. This is a quality of life issue. You want to tell people that their concern and their desire for clean air and clean water is elitist? Tell that to the kids in the South Bronx, which are suffering from the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country. Tell that to the families in Flint, whose kids have their blood is ascending in lead levels. Their brains are damaged for the rest of their lives. Call them elitist. You're telling them that those kids are trying to get on a plane to Davos? People are dying. They are dying. And the response across the other side of the aisle is to introduce an amendment 5 minutes before a hearing in a markup. This is serious. This should not be a partisan issue. This is about our constituents in all of our lives. Iowa, Nebraska, broad swaths of the Midwest are drowning right now, underwater. Farms, towns that will never be recovered and never come back. And we're here and people are more concerned about helping oil companies than helping their own families? I don't think so. I don't think so. This is about our lives. This is about American lives. And it should not be partisan. Science should not be partisan. We are facing a national crisis. And if we do not ascend to that crisis, if we do not ascend to the levels in which we were threatened at the Great Depression, when we were threatened in World War II, if we do not ascend to those levels, if we tell the American public that we are more willing to invest and bail out big banks than we are willing to invest in our farmers and our urban families, then I don't know what we're here doing. I don't know what we're here doing. You know, we talk about cost. We're gonna pay for this whether we pass a Green New Deal or not. Because as towns and cities go underwater, as wildfires ravage our communities, we are going to pay. And we are either gonna decide if we're gonna pay to react or if we're gonna pay to be proactive.